Hello students, this is Lisa Sharlock and we are moving on to the next unit here in Gender and War, and that is about the state of Chhattisgarh. What I'm doing here is basically morphing one series of lectures with another, right, from the book I previously used with the book I assigned this time, so bear with me if it seems a wee bit choppy here. But this is going to be a two-part lecture. In the first part, I'm going to talk about sex, rape, and war just in general. And then the second part of the lecture, which will be a separate video, I will discuss women's role in the insurgency in Chhattisgarh and the readings that I had assigned you about that. Okay, and I am using a new version of Kaltura, so let's see if I can get it to move. There we go. All right. Sex, rape, and war. Okay, so military prostitution is something that has accompanied war for centuries, right? But the extent to which the military is actually involved in prostitution varies across space and time. So, for example, in Asia at the end of World War II and then during the Korean War, the United States basically had taken over the old comfort women stations, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So basically they took over Japanese sex slave camps, and supposedly these women in the U.S. camps were free, but I don't really know how many choices they actually had. So basically Camp Town around South Korea was pretty much decriminalized prostitution, right? And the commanders were worried about the soldiers getting VD and also bad relations with the locals if the men started, having love affairs with the local girls. So basically, they were okay with setting up and regularly testing for VD the prostitutes, bar girls, etc. in Camp Town in South Korea. So in some cases, the military has been involved in outright sex slavery, right? One example of this would be the so-called comfort women, which were basically sex slaves forced to be prostitutes in World War II. And there were several 100,000 of them. Some of them are still alive, right? Some of them were quite young as 12. And you can see here that for the most part, they came from the parts of Asia that Japan had invaded prior to World War II, or just at the beginning of World War II. You'll notice that there were actually some Europeans, some Dutch as well, right? The Dutch had been in Indonesia, etc. So it wasn't entirely Asian women that were forced into sex slavery. So the first comfort station that they set up was in Shanghai, which is now China, after the Japanese had taken Manchuria. And then they started setting up comfort stations throughout areas that were occupied by Japan. And these comfort stations were basically a combination of prison for these women and brothels, right? They were intended to be comfort for the sailors or soldiers. So not surprisingly, those parts of Asia that put up the most resistance to the Japanese were the ones that saw the worst war crimes, including abduction and repeated rape, right? So obviously that's what sexual slavery as a comfort woman was all about. Sometimes the Japanese leaders forced the local Asian leaders to hand over girls. And this was particularly the case in North China and in the Philippines. So to the left, you have soldiers waiting for their turn outside a comfort station. To the right, you have Chinese women who are comfort women. So the number of comfort women increased during the Second World War, and I'll let you read this quote for yourself, right? The reason I go into such detail here is to demonstrate that this was not, this was not maybe a few errant bad apples, as they say, who, were going rogue and setting up a brothel, right? Something on this scale was obviously an official policy. All right, rape and war is the focus of my study and has been for 2.5 decades now, so I could lecture about this until the end of quarantine, probably, but don't worry, I won't. I'm just going to summarize here. So after World War II, of course, rape and war continued. This particular illustration is from the partition of India, in which there were many, many rapes, rape murders, and frequent abduction of girls. Right. So in some cases, the abducted women just lived out the rest of their lives with the men who'd abducted them. In many cases, though, the new states of Pakistan and India wanted their women repatriated. So many of the women had the unenviable fate of then having to leave behind their children and go back to either India or Pakistan. Rape has featured in innumerable anti-colonial and secessionist wars. Right? The example I give here is Bangladesh's War of Independence. But there are many, many such wars in many continents around the world that you could use instead, as an example. The war in the former Yugoslavia, when it was breaking up in the early to mid-1990s, is how I got interested in this subject, because I was working there for a women's group, although it wasn't an anti-rape group, but it was through that I learned about the political uses of sexual violence. And then again in Kosovo at the end of the 1990s, right? So here rape was used as a strategy of war, primarily, but not exclusively, by Serbs against Croat, and particularly the Muslim women of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Right? And here the strategy was often rape until pregnant, right? So it's a tactic of ethnic conflict to dilute the bloodline. And sexual violence has accompanied myriad sub-Saharan African civil wars in the post-World War II era. I've listed some here, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Unfortunately, I picked a research topic in which one never runs out of cases, right? There's always something new. So the million-dollar question is whether rape in war is simply opportunistic or whether it's a strategy. Right? And so I have argued over and over and over that it's a strategy. Right? That doesn't mean it's not opportunistic. Right? It can be both. But we know that rape has accompanied war since time immemorial. Right? And it's usually been said that that's just sort of the way things are. Soldiers plunder, rape, etc. Some people see it as like pent-up energy that needs to be released, or the men are sexually deprived, or whatever. So when I look at rape as a strategy, right, I tend to look at the degree of complicity of politicians and senior commanders, right? So, for example, with the comfort women, looking at the scale of the comfort woman issue indicates that it was not just one or two bad apples who, stole some of the enemy girls and forced them into prostitution, right? It was obviously systematic. So, rape of our women, and our being our nation, our ethnic group, our religious group, right? Rape of our women is a powerful symbol of propaganda, right? So here you can see, I think these are all World War II. Yeah, these are World War II posters, right? So you can see that the threat of the sort of creepy-looking Japanese rapist, and here we have Japan and Germany, right? The Hun, right? Germany. So here we have the threat of the enemy rape of our women, our white women, right? As a powerful motivating factor. It's terrifying, and in order to keep these hands off, you better buy those victory bonds, or else mom is going to get it, right? And many feminists would argue that the crime is not seen so much as a violation of the woman, right, or of the girl, but instead as a crime against the men to whom the woman belongs. Right. Now, I should mention that we know that men get raped too, and men get raped in war, and boys get raped in war too. I don't want to get into an oppression Olympics about whose rape is worse, right? But for rape of women of reproductive age, there's the issue of childbearing, right, which you do not have in gay rape. So that's one sort of different aspect if you're looking at rape as ethnic conflict or rape as genocide, right? So it's been referred to as enemy occupation of the womb, right? If say the pristine white woman's womb is filled with the offspring of the Japanese, right? She can't produce ethnically pure little white babies, right? That's how the logic goes. So all of this ties in to a sexualization of violence, which is, again, something that we could lecture and discuss until the end of time, probably. But there's no shortage of fusion of sexualization and violence in American military history and many others. So you particularly see this in terms of weapons, right? Bombs, knives, etc. Here I'm asking, are they phallic symbols? Well, obviously in these particular patches or pins, they are, right? And sometimes I would ask students, if women designed these weapons, what would they look like? And they look at me like I'm entirely nuts, right? But it's possible that if women were designing these, maybe we would make them look different. I don't know. It's also been said that misogyny is the mother's milk of war. And a common thing among soldiers is to depict the enemy leader as either female or homosexual or both, right? So there's no worse way to humiliate a macho military man than by equating him with a woman or a homosexual. Okay, and at this point I will stop part 1.